Chapter 9. Liberalism. Article 1. What is liberalism? Meaning of the term. The terms liberal and liberalism derive from the Latin word liber, free, mean etymologically such personal qualities or style of acting and thinking as may be thought worthy of a free man. Thus we speak of a liberal education, a broad-minded liberal disposition, etc. In one of its derived meanings, liberalism may also denote a political system or tendency that is opposed to centralization and absolutism. Liberalism, in this sense, may be worthy of praise, and has nothing in it opposed to Catholic principles. The champions of unchristian liberalism frequently utilize these meanings of the term to confuse issues and obscure the real character of their policy. The term is used here, however, in quite a different sense. Since the end of the 18th century, the word liberalism has been generally applied as we apply it here, to denote those tendencies and principles in intellectual, religious, political, and economic life, which imply a partial or total emancipation of man from the obligations of the supernatural order, and even from the authority of God. Liberalism is the direct outcome of Protestantism, of which its principles and policy may be regarded as the ripened fruit. It is the root cause of the evils comprised in what is usually styled the social question, and is at present the greatest obstacle to social prosperity and peace. General character of unchristian liberalism. Unchristian liberalism, or rather the movement which it embodies, is not unfrequently referred to, especially by French Catholic writers, as the Revolution. It is also sometimes called the anti-Christian movement. It is, in fact, essentially revolutionary and anti-Christian, and has been repeatedly condemned as such by the Holy See during the past 2 centuries. Resting on an assumption of man's innate independence of any authority or rule of conduct, or belief outside himself, liberal teaching rejects or ignores the whole supernatural order, including divine revelation, a divinely instituted church, and man's predestination to eternal life. Without formally committing themselves to a positive denial of God's existence, or his possible claims on men in their individual capacity, liberals repudiate all divine authority in public and social life, which, according to their ideals, should be organized and conducted as if God did not exist. Much less will they take account of the teaching of our divine Lord, or acknowledge the authority of the Church which he has founded. Absolute and unlimited freedom of thought, of religion, and of conscience, unchecked freedom of speech and of the press, freedom in political and social institutions is, according to the principles of unchristian liberalism, man's inalienable right. These principles, which, by their repudiation of divine authority, are in opposition even to the natural law, are applied by liberals to moral, political, and economic life. Modern systems of statecraft, of civic organization, of international relations, etc., have been shaped largely under their influence. Hence, liberalism tends strongly to reproduce in society the most repulsive features of pagan civilization. Liberal tenets and the consequences to which they lead are in fact more unnatural than those of the pagans who, although worshipping false gods, acknowledge the claims of religion. Relation of unchristian liberalism to other social forces. One of the strongest driving forces behind the liberalist movement during the past 2 centuries has been Freemasonry, permeated and reinforced as it is by international Judaism. Socialism, which is opposed to many of the economic and political principles of liberalism, is in harmony with its materialistic view of life, and in its assumption of man's emancipation from a supernatural or divine law. The political and economic doctrines which now prevail in Italy under the fascist regime are in some respects a reaction against liberalism. The Catholic Church, with its hierarchical constitution, and its God-given power of authoritative teaching, forms the only effective barrier against the progress of liberalism. This fact has always been frankly recognized by the liberal leaders. Voltaire's impious cry, "Crush the infamous monster," vis-à-vis the Catholic Church, has been re-echoed down to our own day by Voltaire's disciples, who openly proclaim it their aim to put out the lights of heaven, and who would fain believe that Catholic principles and authority are everywhere, even in Ireland, doomed to the fate of icebergs in warm water. The words of Charles Bradlaugh, a professed atheist and one of the founders of the present secularist or extreme liberalist movement in Britain, are equally significant. One element of danger in Europe is the approach of the Roman Catholic Church towards meddling in public life. There is danger to freedom of thought, to freedom of speech, to freedom of action. The great struggle in this country, England, will not be between free thought and the Church of England, but between free thought and Rome. Division of the subject. In order to convey a general but connected idea of unchristian liberalism, which, like Protestantism, is often vague and somewhat intangible, partaking more of the nature of a spirit permeating modern society than of a definite and consistent system of social organization and thought, we shall give a brief sketch first of intellectual liberalism, usually called rationalism or naturalism, which forms the philosophic groundwork of the liberal movement. Secondly, of political liberalism or secularism, upon whose principles the constitutions of most modern states are modeled. And finally, of economic liberalism, which reached its apogee in the 19th century and is closely allied with modern capitalism. Article 2. Rationalism or naturalism. Origin of modern naturalism. The spirit and tendency of the unchristian humanism of the 15th century, and still more the principle put forward by the 16th century reformers, that every individual has the right of interpreting divine revelation according to his own judgment, without the aid of a teaching church, opened the way first to a repudiation of all supernatural revelation, and then to atheism and materialism. During the second half of the 17th century, there arose in England a school of freethinkers and deists, whose teachings, without spreading, for the time being, to any great extent in England itself, exerted much influence in France and the continental countries. A few of these deists remained nominally Christian, but most rejected completely all supernatural religion, and some threw doubt even on the existence of God. Among the best known were John Hobbes, author of the Leviathan, 1651, John Locke, author of the Essay on the Human Understanding, who died 1704, Collins, Rowland, Tyndall, Charles Blount, Lord Bolingbroke, and later on Hume and Berkeley. Protestant Germany gave birth to a similar rationalistic school, founded on the teachings of Leibniz, Wolff, and others, whose names were afterwards overshadowed by that of Immanuel Kant, the greatest of German rationalistic philosophers, and the real founder of the modern German rationalist school. It spread in France. France, however, was or soon became the real center of the naturalist movement. The ground had been prepared there by the Gallican and Jansenist propaganda of the preceding generation, and by the rationalistic tendencies of Descartes' philosophy. But the principal cause of the rapid spread of the movement was the moral corruption which had eaten, like a canker, into the wealthy classes, the aristocracy, and even a considerable portion of the clergy. Voltaire brought from England the doctrines of the English freethinkers and deists, and with Jean-Jacques Rousseau became the most powerful apostle of the new ideas. Soon a whole galaxy of brilliant writers appeared, filled with the spirit of Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Voltaire. Ecclesiastical authority, religion, revelation, all the cherished ideals and principles of Christianity were now persistently held up to ridicule in poetry, romance, drama, letters, historical and philosophical treatises. written mostly in a brilliant and attractive style. The Encyclopedia. The extreme rationalistic doctrine, which denies the existence of God and the immortality of the human soul, rejects the moral law and proclaims war against all authority, was summarized in the celebrated Encyclopedia. This monumental work, the first of its kind, appeared about the middle of the 18th century, under the editorship of Diderot and d'Alembert, and immediately secured unprecedented popularity. In the Encyclopedia, all kinds of subjects were treated and discussed, sometimes with a certain appearance of fairness and impartiality, but always with the underlying purpose of discrediting Christianity. Diderot, in whose mind the virtue of chastity is only the result of ignorant prejudice, sketched an ideal society whose perfection lies in the complete gratification of the sexual passions, while the professed ambition of the Négion, one of Diderot's disciples, was to strangle the last of the priests with the entrails of the last of the kings. This anti-religious campaign in France, resulting in the excesses and religious persecution associated with the French Revolution, was the first great effort of the liberal anti-Christian revolt, which has continued to spread and gain strength down to our own day. Modern phases of naturalism. During the 19th century, the rationalistic movement manifested itself in the pseudo-philosophic theories of pantheism, materialism, and positivism, culminating in modernism, neo-Gnosticism, Theosophism, Christian Scientism, etc. of the present day. The movement has gathered into its wake most of the perverted intellectual forces of Europe. It has spread more or less into every country, but has taken deepest hold in France, Britain, the Protestant portions of Germany, the United States of America, and the British dominions. Pantheism, materialism, and positivism. The pantheistic philosophy of Kant and Hegel in Germany, tending to make each individual a kind of god unto himself, and setting up actual fact, the fait accompli, as the sole criterion of what is reasonable and right, leads, when applied to social life, to a glorification of brute force, and contains besides a philosophic groundwork for the most extreme and selfish individualism. The whole philosophy of materialism, as propounded by Haeckel, Huxley, Spencer, and others, and especially the theories of the evolutionists, including those of the struggle for life and the survival of the fittest, as well as Nietzsche's theory of the Superman, for whose sake other men are born to toil, have similar practical applications. Positivism, which was first put forward by Auguste Comte, who died 1857, was widely adopted by French and English rationalists, such as J.S. Mill, during the second half of the 19th century, and the system a new deity is set up for men to worship and serve. That deity is none other than humanity. Positivism, while encouraging a vague and ineffective philanthropy or humanitarianism, has a predominant tendency, like all forms of rationalism, to an extreme and unnatural individualism. For a positivist, for the average type, tends to regard himself as representing humanity, and consequently to consider himself, and not God, as the summit and center of the universe, towards whose glorification all his interests and efforts must converge. Modernism and Neo-Gnosticism. Modernism, Neo-Gnosticism, Kabbalism, Theosophism, and Spiritism are at present perhaps the most dangerous and insidious forms of rationalism and naturalism. The modernists, who aimed at remaining within the Church's fold while working to undermine her teaching, were condemned by Pius X in 1907. They deny, or strive to whittle down and explain away by specious reasoning, everything supernatural, including miracles, divine revelation, supernatural grace, etc. Neo-Gnosticism, essays to get rid of a deity distinct from man and to whom man is responsible. Hence the votaries of the neo-Gnostic theory deny the dogma of creation. All things, according to their philosophy, are in some way or other emanations of the divine essence. Thus man is practically identified with the deity, with the result that whatever he thinks he does must be right and good. The neo-Gnostic philosophy is apparently the same as, or very similar to, that of the ancient Gnostics, so often referred to in the writings of the early fathers of the Church. This philosophy has reappeared at different times in the history of the Church, assuming various shapes, but remaining always substantially the same, and invariably tending to supply an apparent justification for the unrestrained gratifications of man's worst passions. It was, under varying forms, the underlying philosophy of the Manichaeans of the 5th century, of the Albigenses of the 12th century, and the Waldenses, etc. of later times. It was the heresy, too, of which the Templars of the 15th century were rightly or wrongly accused. The doctrines of Gnosticism and Neo-Gnosticism are closely associated with the occult practices and beliefs of certain pre-Christian sectaries of the East, which have always attracted minds of a certain perverted type, and seem to show strong indications of the direct influence of the Evil One. Gnosticism and its different manifestations are not improbably the heresy or philosophy to which St. Paul is said to refer in his first epistle to Timothy. In the last times, some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to spirits of error and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, and having the conscience seared. Kabbalism, Theosophism. The Kabbalists and Theosophists are closely associated with the Neo-Gnostics, and their theories are only different manifestations of the same desire to free man from all supernatural law, and even from the rule and authority of God. Kabbalism, which betrays the Jewish influence in the modern naturalistic movement, would found its rationalistic doctrines on ancient Jewish tradition, intermingled with pagan and Gnostic philosophy. Theosophy relies for all knowledge, and especially for knowledge of the deity, upon some kind of interior revelation or illumination, the results of the study and contemplation of secret rites and symbols. In some of its forms or teachings, Theosophy seems to contain a blend of pantheism, materialism, and doctrines of the transmigration of souls. It is closely allied to Brahmanism and Buddhism, and tends to teach some kind of universal faith, which would be, as it were, a common denominator, in which all religions and creeds would be at one. For according to the Theosophists, all religions of all times, including Christianity, are but different manifestations of the one true religion, which divine wisdom reveals under varying forms suited to different times, places, and persons. The Theosophist sectaries are much addicted to spiritism, magic, unlawful hypnotism, etc., which they substitute for religious worship. Their profoundly anti-Christian character. All these phases of naturalism are closely associated with the intensive anti-Christian movement of today. The propagation of the neo-Gnostic pseudo-philosophy, as well as that of the Kabbalists and Illuminists, the Theosophists and Spiritists, etc., is in fact the most dangerous phase of the war now waged throughout the world against the Church by the Masonic and Jewish sectaries. Their philosophy cuts deeper into Christian life and affects more fatally the Christian organization of society than their purely political and economic activities, as it tends to destroy the very foundations of all Christian morality and belief. Article 3. Political Liberalism. Introduction. Before proceeding to sketch the nature and history of political liberalism, or secularism, as is sometimes named, it will be useful to recall what we have already touched on in treating of the civil organization and political principles of medieval Europe. The whole political and social structure centered round, or rather, reposed on, the principle that God was its author, and his divine ordinance was recognized as the fundamental sanction of all valid rule and the basis of all social and civil obligations. The general acceptance of this principle secured reverence and obedience towards the government, while setting strict limits to its power, and affording safeguards to the subjects against oppression. When, on the other hand, this principle is ignored, or in other words, when God is eliminated from the political organism and his rights rejected in favor of what are termed the rights of man, as occurs in the liberal system, the foundations of legitimate authority are taken away. There is no fixed principle to set limits to the competency and scope of the ruling powers, and no real safeguard against tyranny and abuse of authority. Principles of political liberalism. Leo XIII summarizes as follows the main political principles of liberalism. The naturalists lay down that all men have the same rights and are, in every respect, of equal and like condition, that each one is naturally free, that no one has the right to command another, that it is an act of violence to require men to obey any authority other than that which is obtained from themselves. According to this, therefore, all things belong to the free people. Power is held by the command of the people, so that whenever the popular will changes, rulers may be lawfully deposed, and the source of all rights and civil duties is either in the multitude or in the governing authority, when the latter is constituted according to the latest doctrines. It is also held that the state should be without God, that in the various forms of religion there is no reason why one should have precedence of another, and that they are all to occupy the same place. Hence, political liberalism may be described as implying the following main principles. 1. Everyone has an inalienable right to freedom of thought, of speech, and of action, a freedom which may be curtailed only where its exercise would clash directly with the rights of other individuals. Besides, no one can be bound to submit to any authority in which he himself has no share. 2. Hence, the rights of God over human society are rejected or ignored. Rulers must base their jurisdiction not on divine authority, but solely upon a supposed delegation from the people. In other words, the sovereignty of the people usurps the position of the sovereignty of God. 3. Religion is relegated from public life into the domain of each one's individual conscience. Hence, there is no public and official recognition of God's supreme authority. The laws of Christianity as such are ignored, and the Church is no longer a public and legal institution. 4. Hence, too, the supposed will of the people may prevail against the law of God, as manifested in the divinely established organization of the human family, or the God-given rights of the individual person, or the constitution of the Church which God has founded. The epigrammatic phrase, "A nation has a right to do wrong," thus expresses a fundamental principle of political liberalism. 5. As the people can exercise their authority only through representatives elected by a majority of votes, and as these representatives in turn usually function by the same means, this unlimited sovereignty of the people is in practice the sovereignty of a majority, whether real or supposed. It is in fact the tyranny of brute force under a new guise, more dangerous than the tyranny of a military dictatorship, because more easily veiled. Hence, Leo XIII again refers to the liberal doctrine of authority as follows. Authority is severed from the true and natural principle, whence it derives all efficacy for the common good, and the law determining what is right to do is at the mercy of a majority. Now, this is simply a road leading straight to tyranny. 6. The state, having now acknowledged responsibility to safeguard the eternal laws of God, no longer recognizes its duty to prevent the spread of false or irreligious doctrines, or to suppress public incentives to vice, except in as far as the interests of mere public order require. Its history. Hobbes and Locke. The English philosopher John Hobbes, already referred to, may be regarded as the founder of modern political liberalism. He wrote at the period of the Puritan Revolution against the Stuarts, and in his two treatises, De Cive, 1642, and The Leviathan, 1651, he upheld the theory of government's absolute and irresponsible power. John Locke, Hobbes' fellow countryman, and his successor in the same school of thought, maintained in his letters on Toleration, 1689, and his essay on civil government, 1690, that the governed possess a permanent and inalienable right to rebel when they so wish. The foundation of the error in case of both these writers was the same. Both theorists eliminate from the civic union the essential element of the authority and the law of God. According to Hobbes, men are naturally free and all seek exclusively their own interests. Hence, men lived at first in a state of perpetual war. Then, as a practical expedient, they compacted to form society, to which, as represented by its rulers, unlimited power over the individual members was confided. This sovereign body Hobbes called the Leviathan, the monster of limitless strength and power, as a logical inference from his rejection of divine authority in the constitution and government of states. Hobbes rejected the distinction between the temporal and spiritual power, and denied the independent rights of the Church. For a man cannot obey two masters, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. Hence, whatever worship or religion exists in a state must be completely subject to the civil power, and no dogma can be appealed to against a law of the state. In Locke's theory, the liberty which man had before the supposed original social contract remains with them and is inalienable. For no one can ever be subjected to authority without his own consent. But as this universal constant can scarcely ever be had, the only remedy against anarchy is that the majority must include the rest. Hence it is a law both of nature and of reason, that the act of the majority is the act of the whole. The principles of Hobbes and Locke were more fully elaborated by the 18th century founders of the French liberal school, and those of the German Aufklärung. Of the latter, Immanuel Kant, who died 1804, has had the widest influence. In Kant's view, man, as a moral being, is a law to himself and an end to himself, a cause, but not an effect. Hence, the civil union, whose object is to secure liberty for all, must presuppose an implied contract as a necessary foundation of its authority. Rousseau. The principal founders of French liberalism were Calvinists, mostly natives of Geneva. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, the best known of these, wrote about half a century after Locke. His great work, Le Contrat Social, appeared in 1761. Like Locke and Hobbes, Rousseau was a deist. He professed a vague belief in a being, whatever he may be, who moves the universe and orders all things. Like his English predecessors, Rousseau bases civil authority upon a supposed social contract, and like Locke, he required the general consent of the governed as an essential condition of authority. Hence, a republic is the best form of government, because it is the most sensitive to the desires of the people. Rousseau develops more fully than Locke the doctrine of man's inalienable independence of all authority outside himself. In his view, all men are naturally free and good. In fact, all are, by nature, kings. And freedom, goodness, and kingship are, according to him, incompatible with submission to rule, except as a result of previous free consent. Since the beginning of the 19th century, Rousseau's theory of man's essential independence of all authority has been further developed. For according to the positivists, such as Auguste Comte and other modern sectaries to whom we have already alluded, all men are gods, or at least every man is a god to himself. Madame de Necker and Madame de Stout, contemporary with Rousseau during the second half of the 18th century, there arose among French literary circles a widespread movement of ideas inspired mainly by Calvinism, and promoted and fostered in its more advanced forms in the Masonic lodges, which were then spread everywhere over France. Madame Necker and her daughter, Madame de Stael, Calvinists and natives of Geneva, were the central figures in these literary circles. De Stael, who was closely associated with Mirabeau and the Constitutional Party of the French Revolution, is the connecting link between liberalism of the 18th and that of the 19th century. She rejects as absurd the Christian principle that human authority is derived from God, as well as the doctrine of a divinely founded church forming a perfect society independent of the state. Declaration of the Rights of Man. All these doctrines took definite political shape in the celebrated Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was drawn up by the French National Assembly in 1789 as the foundation of the new Constitution. This document, which implies a definite abandonment of the Christian political ideals, has had immense influence in shaping the constitution of modern states. According to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the people. Law is only the expression of the general will. Liberty, which is every man's inalienable right, consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one, a limitation which can be determined in the concrete only by the law, which itself is only an expression of the will of the people. No one may be disquieted for his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law, etc. Thus the divine authority, or the will of God, upon which in the medieval Christian ideal all legitimate rule must rest, is definitely eliminated, and the people, fickle, ignorant, weak as they may be, are enthroned in God's place. The rights of God are supplanted in the social order by the rights of man. These principles manifestly imply a denial of all real authority, for men cannot be their own superiors. They are in fact the underlying philosophy upon which all the subversive movements of modern times are based. The destruction of the established order, which accompanied the French Revolution, the confiscation of church property, the civil constitution of the clergy, by which the church in France was subjected to the civil power, were the natural outcome of the principles embodied in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Prevalence of political liberalism. Under the influence of France and England, the liberal movement spread during the 19th century over most of Europe and America. The political principles associated with it now prevail in France, Mexico, Portugal, and Russia, and to a very large extent in the United States of America and the countries of the British Empire. Upon these principles, too, the constitutions of the new states, which were set up as a result of the great European War, have been based. These same principles have, besides, impressed themselves more or less deeply on the laws and administrations of very many other states, such as Spain, whose constitution still, in 1931, remain predominantly Christian. Article 4. Effects of political liberalism on public life. Revolutionary movements. Liberalism is essentially opposed to Christianity. In the case of governments which have fallen completely under its influence, this opposition shows itself in a contempt for the principles of Christian morality, and sometimes even a systematic persecution of the Catholic Church. In the case of Catholic states, such as Spain, Italy, Portugal, and the states of Spanish America, which were not much affected by Protestantism, and where the Catholic tradition was strong enough to resist the peaceful penetration of the liberal movement, the introduction of liberalism, with its Masonic alignments, has always tended to produce revolution and social upheavals. In fact, most of the revolutions that have taken place in Europe and America for the past century and a half have been, to a very large extent, the offspring of liberalism and Freemasonry. Degradation of public life, egoism and sordid ideals, oppression of the weak and a cynical disregard of social justice, the spread of corruption and vice by means of the press, a free and unscrupulous use of slander, corruption, and fraud in political life. These and such likes traits invariably accompany the introduction of liberalism into a state. That it should be so is inevitable. When once the claims of God and the authority of God's law are refused their due place in the legislature and administration of the state, the very basis of public morality is removed, and human enactments or coercive force become the only, or the main, principles of discrimination between right and wrong. Laws and administrative activities injurious to family life, or opposed to the rights of the Church, being no longer regarded as essentially invalid and unconstitutional, sooner or later force an entrance into the state. The obligations of social justice, charity, and Christian patriotism cease to have a clear meaning and are gradually forgotten. The principles of naturalism find expression in the current literature, the press, the theater, and the cinema, with the result that the whole tone of social life is gradually lowered to the non-Christian level. The administration of the state falls under the control of unscrupulous political adventurers who, while pretending to rule in the people's name, abuse their power for personal aggrandizement, while the people themselves are enslaved and ground down by exorbitant taxes. Hence, Leo XIII, speaking of the public evils which result from the widespread perversion of the primary truths on which, as on its basis, human society rests, refers in a special way to the reckless mismanagement, waste, and misappropriation of public funds, and the shamelessness of those who, full of treachery, make semblance of being champions of country and freedom and every kind of right. Perversion of the idea of liberty. A. The true idea. Another element in the demoralizing influence of political liberalism is the perverted idea of human liberty upon which the liberals found their political system. According to Christian teaching and true philosophy, the liberty, to which everyone has a natural right, differs essentially from a license to do evil. It implies, indeed, freedom from unjust constraint, and the safe and unimpeded enjoyment of one's natural and acquired rights. But it does not mean to imply a license to act or speak or write falsely or sinfully, or a right to do anything injurious to public good. Again, true Christian liberty is quite consistent with due submission to all lawful authority, and authority may be lawful, even though the subjects have no voice in its exercise. For while it is true that everyone has a right to be governed justly, and that civil authority should be exercised solely for the good of the people, it does not follow that everyone has a natural, much less an indefeasible right to a share in the government. Hence, too, the Church, which has always been the champion and upholder of true liberty, has no special predilections regarding the form of government, vis-a-vis whether it be monarchical or democratic, provided the conditions required for just rule be fulfilled. Neither can it be shown that the democratic form of government, vis-a-vis that in which the actual rulers are elected from time to time by the popular vote, is always, or even usually, the best, or that it contains any sure guarantee against tyranny and the oppression of the masses of the people. B. The perverted liberal view. According to the liberal teaching, on the other hand, liberty is bound up essentially with a political franchise, as if it were against reason that one should submit to an authority, in which he does not himself share. Furthermore, it includes the right of professing and preaching false religions, of propagating false philosophy, of speaking or writing what is false or injurious to public morals. In a word, it implies a license to do anything that does not directly disturb the peace or violate commutative justice, even though it may injure the religious belief or morality of the people. And to liberty, thus falsely defined, the liberals assert that every citizen has an unalienable right. Under cover of such principles as these, vice is freely propagated by means of an immoral literature, a licentious press, and a degrading cinema and theater. The drink traffic and the sporting and betting syndicates are allowed to function freely under the protection of the law, to the detriment and degradation of the people. The principle is acted upon, and sometimes openly proclaimed, that, in a free country, the public administration must not interfere with the liberty of the subject, even while he is propagating ideas subversive of morality, or dangerous to the people's faith, or while, in the pursuit of unholy gain, he is propagating the vices of drunkenness, idleness, gambling, and unchastity. Article 5. Liberal Catholicism. What it means. A milder form of political liberalism, but one which has wrought much injury to the Church during the past century, is what is known as liberal Catholicism. This system was first formulated by the Abbé de Lamennais in L'Avenir, early in the 19th century, and was defended for a while by such illustrious men as Lacordaire, Montalembert, Dupanloup, etc. The liberal Catholics, while recognizing that God is the ultimate source of civil authority, would regulate the relations between church and state, and some other details in the social organism, in accordance with the more moderate liberal principles as expounded by Benjamin Constant. In this system, the church and state would be completely divorced from each other. The civil power would profess no particular religion, and remain quite indifferent to religious interests, neither obstructing nor assisting the work of the church. There would thus be a free church in a free state, an equal toleration for all religions whose tenets and practices do not interfere with the established social order. The system thus advocating as admissible, if not desirable, and in complete accordance with Catholic principles, is practically identical with the system with which we are familiar in these countries since the cessation of the persecution of the Church. Condemnation of liberal Catholicism. This system was condemned by Gregory XVI and again by Pius IX. Leo XIII, who confirms the condemnation of Catholic liberalism previously made, assigns the reasons why it is opposed to the Church's teaching. Since the state is a moral person created by God, it must formally acknowledge God's authority and give him public worship in its corporate capacity. Justice therefore forbids, and reason itself forbids, the state to be godless or to adopt a line of action which would end in godlessness, namely, to treat the various religions, as they call them, alike, and to bestow upon them promiscuously equal rights and privileges. For God must be worshipped in the manner which he himself has ordered, and in communion with the Church which he has established. Hence, the true religion is the only one that should be recognized or assisted by the state. Toleration of false religions. Leo XIII, however, adds that Holy Church, allowing for human weakness, does not forbid public authority to tolerate error, when a well-founded fear of a greater evil counsels such toleration. For while holding it unlawful to place the various forms of divine worship on the same footing as a true religion, the Church does not condemn those rulers who, for the sake of securing some greater good, or of hindering some great evil, allow custom or usage to be a kind of sanction for each kind of religion having place in the state. He goes on, however, to say in another pronouncement on the same matter that the more a state is driven to tolerate evil, the further it is from perfection, and that the tolerance of evil which is dictated by prudence should be strictly confined to the limits which its justifying cause, the public welfare, requires. Hence, although existing false religions may be tolerated in a Catholic state, as far as may be necessary for the public peace, it does not follow that further false systems of propagation of unchristian or irreligious opinions or false or immoral teaching may be allowed. That would be contrary to the primary duty of the civil power, which is to safeguard the religious, moral, and intellectual interests of the people, as well as to promote their material well-being. Article 6. Economic Liberalism. not necessarily connected with material progress. The false principles of unchristian liberalism, which have wrought such havoc during the past 2 centuries in the moral, intellectual, and political spheres, have had in their application to economic life equally disastrous effects upon the material well-being of the people. In fact, all or most of the excessive poverty, insecurity, and degradation which are outstanding features in our modern civilization are traceable to these principles and the social organization founded upon them. It is sometimes assumed, especially by non-Catholic writers, that liberalism has some kind of necessary connection with commerce and manufacturing, as if these latter could flourish only under liberal regime. There is no foundation for such an assumption. Commerce and manufacture had already made great progress in Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries, under the financial predominance of the great Catholic republics of Florence, Pisa, Venice, and Genoa. These and the Hanseatic cities of Germany and the Low Countries attained at that time a degree of wealth, power, and culture which, in some respects, has never been surpassed or perhaps equaled at any other period of European history. The invention of the mariner's compass and of printing, the discovery of America and of the new route to the East, the colonial expansion of Spain and Portugal, all these and other causes led to an immense increase of industrial and commercial activity centuries before the rise of liberalism, and while the Catholic economic principles founded on Christian teaching, as expounded by St. Thomas and the great scholastic authors, still held undisputed sway. Mercantile system of economics. After the rise of Protestantism, however, and especially under the influence of Calvinism and of the new pagan ideals connected with the Renaissance, non-Christian principles began to exert an ever-increasing influence in industrial and commercial relations. What is known as the mercantile system of economics arose in the 16th century. This system reached its highest development about the middle of the 17th century, and continued to prevail till the rise of liberalism. The mercantile policy is closely associated with the Elizabethan legislation and the English navigation and corn laws. Strafford and Cromwell in England, as well as Colbert, the minister of Louis XIV of France, are usually mentioned as the best-known representatives of a mercantile economic policy. The prevalence of the system coincided with the growth of the power of England and Holland in the 17th century. The purely economic principles of mercantilism were adapted to the building up of a strong military state. With this end in view, manufacture and commerce were assiduously promoted, and the importance of protective tariffs and state intervention in individual activities very much emphasized. Each nation aimed at acquiring great quantities of the precious metals, which were regarded as synonymous with wealth. Such a view is manifestly false. Wealth cannot be conceived in an exclusively objective sense, and apart from the human persons, whose needs it is meant to satisfy. Besides, gold and silver are only one form of wealth understood, even in its objective sense. There are numberless other commodities more essential for human needs than the precious metals, and these are also wealth, which therefore has no essential connection with money, much less with silver or gold. The mercantile economists erred, too, in another way, for while they made military power, national aggrandizement, and colonial expansion the great objects of public endeavor, the well-being of the multitude, which in Christian philosophy is regarded as the primary end and purpose of all the state's activities, was largely forgotten or neglected. Oppressive taxes were imposed and inequitably distributed. The agricultural classes were impoverished, and the public finances became confused and chaotic. Rise of economic liberalism. These evils helped to bring about the general abandonment of the mercantile system, and in the 18th century the system of economic liberalism, which was still further removed from Christian ideals, began to prevail. In the liberal system, national aggrandizement was still regarded as the primary duty of the government, which, however, now concentrated upon industrial rather than military power. The wealthy industrial and mercantile classes, which, as a consequence of the Protestant upheaval, had acquired excessive power, especially in Britain, found in the principles of liberalism an excellent opportunity of exploiting the labor of the poor for personal and national aggrandizement. The Physiocrats. Some of the principles of economic liberalism had been previously put forward by the French Physiocrats. This small group of writers appeared in the second half of the 18th century, and were the real founders of the modern science of economics. The term physiocrat, adapted from the Greek, means one who advocates the rule of nature. The Physiocrats were much influenced by the unchristian philosophy of Voltaire, Rousseau, and the Encyclopedias, and were the first to formulate the maxim, which the liberal economists afterwards adopted as a fundamental principle, of the non-intervention of the state in industrial and commercial life, laissez-faire and laissez-passer. They also put forward the erroneous interpretation of the natural law, which was afterwards adopted and developed by the liberal economists. Of the Physiocrats, the best-known names are Quesnay, who died 1774, the founder of the school, Turgot, who died 1778, financial minister of Louis XVI, de Gournay, who died 1759, and Dupont de Nemours, who died 1768. Classical School of Economics. It was in Britain, however, that liberalism was first formulated into a complete economic system. This was done by the writers of the so-called Classical School, of which the Scotchman Adam Smith was the founder. Adam Smith's great work, Enquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations, appeared in 1776. The other leading writers of English liberal school are Malthus, who published his famous essay of the Principles of Population in 1789, David Ricardo, author of the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817, and John Stuart Mill, whose Principles of Political Economy appeared in 1848. Materialism and utilitarianism are dominant characteristics in the works of these and the other English writers of the liberal school. Most of them also show determined hostility to religion, and a profound opposition to the Christian principles of social and domestic life. The principles of the classical school have dominated British economic policy and law down to our time, although since about 1870, strong opposing currents have appeared both in doctrine and in legislative tendencies. Its main tenets. We may summarize the principal tenets of the classical school, so far as they concern us here, in the three following propositions. 1. Untrammeled liberty for the individual in economic action is the only sure foundation of economic progress and social harmony, just as liberty in religious belief is the only foundation of true religion, and liberty and equality in political action are necessary for good government. 2. The material self-interest of the individual, which is always his only motive of action, and which supplies an unlimited stimulus to human endeavor, works out infallibly for the greater good of the whole social body. 3. Hence, free trade with foreign countries and free competition between individuals or corporations, each working exclusively for his or its own material interests, implying the non-interference of the government in the operation of finance, and the relations between employers and employed, etc., must be regarded as a fundamental principle in the constitution of the state. These principles have been in large measure the intellectual groundwork upon which the modern capitalistic system has been built upon, and are accountable for some of the worst evils of modern industrialism. It was under plea of these principles that the customs duties between Ireland and England were practically abolished in 1800, with disastrous effects upon Irish manufacturing industry. It was these principles, too, that formed the nucleus of the group of ideas comprehended in the term Manchester School, of which Sir Robert Peel, Cobden, and Bright were the best-known representatives. The teachings of the Manchester School were the driving force behind the free trade movement in the 19th century. The free trade movement led to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1848, a measure which was ruinous to Ireland and did much to destroy the agricultural life of Britain itself. Credit Reform Movement. Partly as a reaction against some of the abuses to which economic liberalism has led, namely the dominance of the financial magnates and the private monopoly of credit, there came into prominence after the European War what may be described as a kind of a new economic school, giving rise to what is sometimes described as the Credit Reform Movement. A group of English writers, including Major Douglas, Orridge, editor for some time of the New Age, Professor T. Lottie, M.A. Kitson, and others, while emphasizing the abuses and injustice associated with the present monetary system, which they say is even technically unsound and leads necessarily to poverty, unemployment, and war, propose an alternative system in which gold would be definitely abandoned as a medium of exchange. In the proposed system, the conduct of industry would be carried on under the control of professional or industrial syndicates or guilds, enjoying a large measure of autonomy. The currency, represented by coupons issued by state-controlled banks, would correspond to and vary in symbolic value with the actual volume of production each year. The scheme, the merits of which it is outside our scope to discuss, has not gained the approval, at least of its entirety, of any of the recognized economists, who condemn it as embodying or leading to a state socialism. On the other hand, some important elements in it, such as its rejection of the dominance of industry by the moneyed interests and the setting up of industrial corporations with an extensive measure of autonomy, seem to bear a certain resemblance to the orthodox Catholic ideal as outlined in the recent encyclical of Pius XI. Article 7. Critique of Economic Liberalism. Its philosophic groundwork. Without discussing in detail the purely economic tenets which distinguish the different schools of liberal economic writers, we shall now indicate, in a general way, the main points in which economic liberalism is at variance with Christian principles. In the philosophy of liberalism, the science of economics, no less than those of politics and jurisprudence, has been unnaturally divorced from the science of ethics. Its whole scope is confined to the methods and means of producing and accumulating wealth. For in the doctrines of liberalism, wealth is regarded as an end in itself, instead of being a means to promote the temporal well-being of the people, as if the wealth or prosperity of a state could be justly estimated, apart from the prosperity and well-being of the individuals that compose it. Again, as a result of their ignoring divine authority and man's eternal destiny, the liberals put forward an idea of the natural law which is radically false and misleading. Ignoring or denying original sin, they identify the natural law with the lower tendencies of man, his innate selfishness and his natural craving for wealth and power and pleasure, leaving out of consideration the dictates of his higher nature, which subordinate these tendencies to God's law and man's own eternal interests. Upon this false view of the natural law, coupled with the equally perverted concept of human liberty, which we have already discussed, the liberals base their whole economic system. Nature, they say, has provided for men's happiness by implanting in the human heart certain instincts which, when allowed full scope, work inevitably for the general harmony and for the good of all. Hence, the path to prosperity and peace is found by allowing these tendencies free play. Hence, too, the state has no duty to regulate the use of property, to control free competition, or to safeguard the interests of the poor and the weak against the wealthy and the strong. As an inference from these principles, the so-called rights of ownership are regarded as independent of all limitations, even of such as may come from the fundamental rights of others to a reasonable means of livelihood. Hence, we may summarize the Catholic attitude towards economic liberalism in 3 sentences. Its main principles are false, Many of the inferences and assertions which the system includes are contrary to experience. In its practical application, it has proved disastrous to the temporal well-being of the people, which it is the object of the state to promote. A. Principles false. The abstract principles upon which the liberal economic system is based are contrary to Christian teaching and are ethically false. We have already pointed out the fallacy underlying the liberal view of human liberty, which is one of the fundamental principles of the whole liberal position. The liberal concept of the natural law, in which man's relations to God and to his own eternal destiny are ignored, and man is regarded as an isolated, individualistic being, devoid of all natural social rights and duties, is equally misleading. Man's relation to God and to his own eternal happiness and misery lie at the very root of his being and dominate every activity of his life, and so are essentially included in the natural law. Again, as man's nature has been fashioned in such a way as to need and to be suited for civil association with his fellow man, the natural law also includes the duties and rights of legal and distributive justice, as well as those of charity and patriotism, which form the bonds of social and civil life. Hence the economic man of Adam Smith and the classical school of economists, in which the human being is considered as a detached from all social ties and actuated solely by a desire to acquire wealth, with no spiritual or moral impulse, no ideals of charity or patriotism, no obligation of social justice, etc., is not the man that actually exists. The economic man is a pure figment of the mind, and has no relation to real life. Finally, since God created the goods of the earth for the use of all, human ownership or one's right to one's property is only a stewardship, and carries with it an obligation, which may be, and where necessary, should be defined by the civil law, of exercising one's ownership in accordance with right reason and the common good, and of taking account of the needs of others and their natural right to a fair opportunity of procuring a becoming livelihood. Hence, although it is true, as liberals assert, that nature and the laws of nature have made due provision for man's temporal happiness, nature has to be understood in its true sense, as including man's relations to God and to the society of which he forms a part, and not in the one-sided and purely materialistic sense in which liberal philosophers use the term. B. Inferences and assertions contrary to experience. It is untrue and contrary to experience that material selfishness is the only motive of men's energy, and that this motive supplies an inexhaustible incentive to human endeavor. Such an assertion is derogatory to human dignity, and a libel upon man's nature, besides his material needs and his natural desire for material betterment. Man has also intellectual, moral, and religious needs and tendencies. Although the former do supply a powerful incentive to human endeavor, religion, patriotism, and philanthropy also exert immense influence on man's activities. Besides, material wants and desires are not limitless, whilst man's desire and longing after moral and intellectual excellence increase in proportion to his successful efforts to attain it. C. Injurious to the well-being of the people. The application to economic life of the liberal principles of individualism and egoism cannot lead to social peace and prosperity, and to expect it to do so is in contradiction to experience and history. The assertion that the untrammeled liberty of the individual in economic activities can supply a sure foundation of peace and harmony need not be seriously discussed. Human society is unthinkable apart from social rights and duties, and a due regard for the common good, all of which must limit individual liberty. Besides the limitations set up by the natural law, it is a matter of common sense and experience that public authority must in many ways interpose its sanctions to secure that social rights and duties be respected, and the common good adequately safeguarded. Hence, Pius XI, treating of economic liberalism, writes, Free competition, though within certain limits, just and productive of good results, cannot be the ruling principle of the economic world. This has been abundantly proved by the consequences that have followed from the free rein given to these dangerous, individualistic ideals. The freedom accorded by English law to the Irish landlords of the 18th and 19th centuries to rack rent and arbitrarily evict their tenants did not lead to harmony or justice between the two classes concerned, and far from promoting material welfare or economic progress, resulted in the pauperization and partial extermination of the agricultural population. Neither did the liberty which the British manufacturing employers enjoyed during the same period to beat down the wages of their workers to a standard of bare subsistence and to subject them to inhuman conditions produce harmony between the classes or promote social progress, so far as the overwhelming majority of the people were concerned. Indeed, the indictment of history against the principles of economic liberalism is quite overwhelming. It is the practical application of these principles that has led to Irish and British pauperization, which in extent and intensity is unparalleled in Europe. The same principles are accountable for the unchristian character of the British poor law system of the 19th century, for the horrors of the English factory system of the first half of the same century, for such national crimes as the Irish famines of the 18th and 19th centuries, for the periodic famines in India, for the evils connected with the modern capitalism such as cornering, profiteering, and gambling on the stock exchange, the consequent extremes of poverty and wealth, the class antagonism, the misery and moral degradation of the poorer classes. Unlimited freedom of competition in economic matters sets up in fact a species of anarchy, as a result of which the weaker members of the social body inevitably fall under the domination of the stronger and more ruthless. At the present day, this economic dominance is realized and exercised through money and the monopoly of credit concentrated in the power of the few. This accumulation of power, writes Pius XI, the characteristic note of the modern economic order, is a natural result of the limitless free competition, which permits the survival of those only who are the strongest, which often means those who fight most relentlessly and pay the least heed to the dictates of conscience. Hence, too, the enforcing of the principle of unlimited freedom of competition has had the effect of destroying all competition and producing unjust monopolies. This result, which the present day has been substantially realized, is also deplored by Pius XI. Free competition is dead. Economic dictatorship has taken its place. Unbridled ambition for domination has succeeded the desire for gain. The whole economic life has become hard, cruel, and relentless in a ghastly measure. The logical development and practical tendency of economic liberalism are towards a return to the economic system prevailing in Europe before the rise of Christianity, namely, the establishment of the servile state. Where such development does not occur, the existence of liberal capitalism inevitably causes a reaction towards socialism.